word.
So as you guys are hopping on and getting set here, Dr. Lawson and I had talked about, well, how passionate he is about this lecture and how much this dovetails with a lot of the doctoral work that he did, and just so many things about him that it just felt like, oh my goodness, you would be missing out if you couldn't get this lecture from Dr. Lawson. And so I'm just so thrilled that you are doing this, and I know that it's just going to be a benefit to everyone. And then you who are in the Fargo cohort, at the end, when it's time for questions, we might stay a little bit just to hear a broad piece about question and answer, but then we'll break off into our own Zoom room so that you can talk to me about specific questions related to the assignment. So, and that'll give the students in Bismarck more opportunity to speak with Dr. Lawson. So.
Sound like a plan? I think we have everybody now, so we will go ahead and get started. All right, and so today's topic is occupational justice. And so we may have, or you may have heard some inklings about this topic, just mentioned in some of your readings prior to this class. But we really wanted to have a class focusing on these issues. So today's learning objectives, we're going to examine social and occupational justice issues, articulate concepts of health disparities or health inequities, identify and compare and contrast at-risk populations for health disparities or inequities, and also occupational injustices, state the importance of occupation in the promotion of health and prevention of disease and disability, and examine the role of occupational therapy in addressing the needs of those affected by social and occupational injustice. So when I hear the term occupational justice, I'm really thinking about more global issues we have in our society, issues we have right here in our community, where some people are less fortunate than others. Some people have greater risk for developing health concerns than others. And so occupational justice really brings in the lens of the OT to help look at, identify what some of these issues are. And then now we're at the level of evidence where we're saying, hey, OT can do something about these global issues. Okay, and so that's really what we're going to talk about and what's really, really cool. So some of these slides are really wordy because I'm taking quotes directly from those theorists, right? Those people who really coined the term occupational justice. And I'll do my very best to kind of break them down a little bit. And so Wilcock and Hocking are really well known in the literature for first discussing occupational justice. And they started talking about it in the 1990s, and it's been slowly evolving ever since then. And so I'm going to read these quotes and then we'll try and put it together a little bit. Occupational justice, concerned with the ethical, moral, and civic issues such as equity and fairness for individuals and collectives specific to engagement in diverse and meaningful occupation. Occupation that includes doing what we do, being how we just be, right? Belonging, who do we belong with? How do we belong in a community? And becoming, who do we want to become? So when we think about occupation, right, it's being able to do the things we want and need and have to do. Just being who we are as a person, being where we want to be, feeling that sense of belonging in our community, and having that hope and striving for becoming who we want to become. And so for some reason in our society, there are reasons why that equity among people, and when they say collectives, I feel like that's populations of people, where that's not fair. where they can't do what they want to do. They can't simply belong, and they don't have opportunities to become who they want to become. And that's unfair, right? That's unethical. That's terrible. And so as OTs, we're charged with expanding our practice to try and address these inequities that are arising from some of these social conditions. Okay, social conditions where people are born, right? If you're born in, I think there was a statistic, Sierra Leone, it's a small little country in Africa, right? If you were born in Sierra Leone and you are a little girl, you have a 74% chance of dying before you're the age of 5. Okay, so just because of where you're born, that could affect your health. That could affect how long you live. That could affect your quality of life. Right. And so the World Health Organization is saying, hey, OTs can really step in here and really make a difference with these populations of people and trying to bring equity to their ability to engage in occupation. So that's really, really powerful. Occupational justice allows us to develop places, structures, to relook at policies and laws so that we can have equitable and diverse participation in either personal occupations, collective occupations, and even civic occupations. Okay, occupations that help us be citizens. Think of, it was a voting year this year, right? Think of all of the people who were quarantined, right? And all the people, if they didn't open up and they didn't change that policy of absentee voting and early voting and those sorts of things, how many people wouldn't have been able to engage in that civic occupation, that civic right of being able to vote? Okay, pretty powerful. And so again, when we're encouraged to develop places and structures and policies, it's meant to create disability-friendly places, structures, and policies, right? To protect those people with disabilities, to give them the opportunity to engage in those occupations. For age-friendly, making it all-inclusive, right? Mental health friendly, being accepting of different mental health conditions and being open to allowing all people all of their abilities to still be who they are, to feel that sense of belonging and giving them hope to become that person they want to become. Okay, so again, lots of quotes here. And so I'm going to sort of leave you with that. Well, not leave you, but have this here, and we're going to come back to some of these occupational justice concepts. So this has become a theory, right? So like I mentioned, Wilcock and Townsend started talking about this in the 90s, right? And they've been talking about it for a long time. And if you remember the occupational science, right? Remember that lecture? I think it was like the second lecture of this course. Ooh, that's a long time ago. But we talked about different levels of evidence, right? Level 1 evidence was just identifying concepts, right? And so in the early 90s, and as those conversations started happening about occupational justice, what is it? What are some of the main concepts, right? That's where the literature really started driving and started going. Level 2 evidence then is sort of that identifying relationships, right? So I've talked about there are certain populations of people out there in our world that can't engage in occupations that they should be able to, right? And so level 2 evidence is saying, hey, those people who are incarcerated, right, they can't engage in meaningful occupation, and it's causing these particular issues, these particular conditions. Right. And so we're at that level 2 area of evidence right now, currently. And so it's this evolving theory. It's still emerging. That's why it's exciting. Okay. But it is grounded in the belief that humans are occupational beings. we know this, right? I think every model of practice we've talked about how people are occupational beings. Humans participate in occupations that are culturally defined, right? So because of my culture, because of the community in which I live, because of how I was raised, those rules of the road that I was taught as a young child, I dress a certain way, right? I get myself dressed a certain way. I have my hygiene a certain way. I cook certain foods a certain way. And all of those occupations really determine my health, right? If I don't eat the foods that I grew up that I know I should eat, I might get sick, right? If I don't have adequate hygiene, I might get sick. If I don't wear appropriate clothing, I might get sick. So all of those occupations determine my health, but also determine quality of life. So remember then back to 707, OT evaluation. What are the overall outcomes? What do we want to achieve in occupational therapy, right? What are our occupational therapy outcomes using outcome measures, right? We can look at self-care. We can look at quality of life, right? Remember the stroke-specific quality of life scale, right? We just covered that one not too long ago. And so that can make sense to us. Now here where maybe it looks maybe a little bit different. Maybe we haven't heard of this concept yet, but when we're using occupational justice as a theory, we're really considering the moral, the ethical, and the political ideas of justice, what's right and fair on occupation. So is it moral? Is it ethical for somebody not to be able to engage in some occupation that they find meaningful, that they need to do to be healthy, that they need to do to have quality of life? Okay, so looking at diverse occupational needs, strengths, and potentials of individuals and groups while considering issues of what's right, what's fair, who's empowered, how can we enable people, groups of people, so that they can get occupational opportunities, so that they can attain those occupational opportunities? Okay, so that's the role of OT. But how can we do that? So let's take a look back at history, right? Occupational justice is founded under the realm of social justice. Okay, has anybody ever taken a social justice class before? Or maybe a sociology course before? Kind of reminds me a little bit about sociology, the study of what's happening in our societies, some of the issues that are happening in our society. And so if we think back to the field of social justice, social work, right, it tends to be interdisciplinary. So many disciplines can consider to society or social justice, okay? And social justice was central to the arts and crafts movement. Did you know that? What other profession was founded during the arts and crafts movement? Let me give you a hint. Starts with an O, ends with a T. OT. So at the beginning of these professions, we have the common social justice, right? And so I feel like this is where both fields of OT and social justice can be very similar, because we're coming from the same roots, from that arts and crafts movement, from the actual doing of occupation, of doing something that makes us feel good, doing something that contributes to our well-being, our quality of life. Okay, and so social justice really focuses in and hones in on a just, non-discriminatory relationship, okay, between individuals, groups, and society in which we live, meaning that everybody should be equal. Every man, woman, child chicken, chihuahua, I don't know. All of them should have equal rights. And so when we think about social justice, being a foster parent, being immersed in that whole world for several years now, I think of social services, right? And when I look at social services, what does social services do? Certainly they work under social justice, but they share resources. They distribute resources to those who need them, right? So everybody has the right to meet their basic needs. So some of the social services that are out there, right, for people with lower socioeconomic status, right, they can get assistance with food stamps. It's not food stamps anymore, it's EBT, right, to get assistance for food. Because everybody has the right to meet their basic need. Eating, being able to have access to healthy foods, that's a basic need. Okay, so those social services work under the realm of social justice, and they provide resources to help people be equal, to give people the same opportunity. Same thing, people with lower socioeconomic status, right? With housing assistance, so they can afford housing and they're not homeless. Heating assistance, that's a huge thing in North Dakota, where they can apply and they can get assistance paying for heat. Okay. So that's where social services, social justice, it's that equitable distribution of sharing resources, because everybody has that right to meet their basic needs. With social justice, we identify that there are differences in health because of people's wealth status, okay? People with lower socioeconomic status tend to have greater health challenges. We know that, okay? There's social privilege in our communities, in our society, right? Where there's some societies, some communities where there may be some individuals that are born into privilege. They may have certain privileges, they may have certain advantages over others that are born in that same community. Okay, and that kind of gets into perhaps race equality and gender equality, right? People with, and that goes into, this summer we saw a lot of racial discourse, rightfully so, with Black Lives Matter movement, right? There was some issues with white privilege and racial privilege and those sorts of things that caused a lot of societal discourse. The same goes for gender equality too, right? There's still, we look at women and men, and they're still saying that women get paid less for the same job out there, right? There's differences out there in our society, whether we want to close our eyes to them and look away and say they don't exist. But our social justice system is saying, no, there is something going on here. There is something going on here. And so as OTs, we commonly, when we're working in the clinic and the hospital, in practice and school systems, we're commonly see social issues with employment, right? Where I may have clients who are unemployed and they can't get a job because they hurt themselves, right? And now they can't get back to work. I may work with some children. Okay, I worked with a lot of kids who were having a lot of issues with fine motor skills, issues with handwriting. Well, handwriting could be a school-based occupation, right? But they didn't score low enough on some of their assessments. So they fell through the cracks because they didn't get the support they needed in school because they didn't meet qualifications. Okay, adults and seniors who lack resources. I've worked with many older individuals who couldn't afford their medications, who couldn't get to their appointments, right? Great, you're coming to outpatient therapy, but you have no means of transportation to get here. And so then they go without therapy, okay? So that really impacts people's opportunity to live, right? That really impacts if you can't engage in occupation, if you remain unemployment, if you're not getting adequate support, if you can't afford your medications. Think of how that affects mental health. Think about how that affects physical health, social health, even your spiritual health. Okay, and that's where I became pretty passionate about this, because almost all of my clients I can think of, I saw issues with this, and it made me very angry in practice. It made me very, very angry that my clients had to experience some of this. And if they just could have something out there or some kind of support, that it could help. Occupation. So if we review what occupation is, okay, all things that people want, need, or have to do, whether of a physical, mental, social, sexual, political, spiritual nature, and is inclusive of rest and sleep. Okay, so occupation can be anything physical, mental, social. They consider sex as a self-care now in our OT practice framework, engaging in politics and anything political. And they're also, of course, and we know in our models, some of our models of practice that addressed our spiritual self as well, and then rest and sleep. So that's what we want people to be able to engage in, right? That contributes to overall health and wellness with their mental, physical, social, and spiritual health. So how do you think occupation is affected with certain populations of people? Okay, how do you think then occupation, I gotta move faces here. How do you think occupation is affected with populations of people who come from a lower socioeconomic status, who feel socially underprivileged, maybe because of race or gender inequalities, or maybe because of overall abilities or disabilities? Okay, now I'm doing some really heated conversations here, and I want to give you guys an opportunity, maybe just 5 minutes or so, but think about, I'm going to have little breakout rooms here. Think about how occupation could be affected with each and or every or any of those. Just try and think of some examples. How is occupation affected with lower socioeconomic status, social privilege, race, gender, abilities, and disabilities? Okay, so I'm going to throw in some breakout rooms here. Where'd you go? There we go. And I might not be able to get into each breakout room, but when we come back in about 5 minutes, 6 minutes, I'll ask for a couple examples, maybe that you're aware of, that you've experienced. Okay, here we go. Options. I will do 6 minutes. Open. All right, I think everybody is back. So what are some examples you guys came up with? Let's hear from you guys. How is occupation affected? Maybe with populations who experiences difference in wealth, social privilege, race, gender, and abilities, disabilities. What'd you talk about?
So I talked about one. I have a cousin and she jokes about this quite a bit. She is Black, gay, and a woman. And she's like, so I kind of got the 3 strikes for getting judged a little bit. And so she is an extremely hard worker, and anything she puts her mind to, like, she'll get it done. And she has a white name. Her name is Savannah. And so, she doesn't, she says, she's like, because her dad's Black and her mom's half white, half Mexican. And she has noticed that compared to her brother, Ernie, who doesn't exactly probably have the most common white name, she gets a lot more interviews for jobs, like phone interview, or like if she's on the phone and they call her, or if she's on like an application, she gets a lot more interviews because of her name and because of like how she sounds compared to her brother. And her brother really wants to work with kids, but because he is this big burly man and he's just the way he looks, like they don't even give him a second glance. And so they're both like extremely hard workers and like care extremely just about what they want to do. But she definitely gets some more opportunities. And she has said that she comes into interviews and they're actually like, you can tell that they're like, you're not the Savannah we got an interview for. And so just like the opportunity for employment has pretty much always been a struggle for the both of them, just when she goes into person, and then when my older cousin Ernie just even tries to get an interview.
So certainly occupation is affected, and that could be related to race and maybe a little social privilege in there as well. Other examples you guys talked about? That's a really good example.
Our group talked a little bit about occupational maybe expectations with some of these, with SES status, different ethnic groups, races. So just the expectation that kids work more, or, which causes them to spend less time in social participation or with their education, or they're not allowed to, they don't have time to do certain things because they're expected to provide or help take care of younger siblings or take care of their families. And so that they just don't have the ability to do all occupations, which, can cause a lot of other mental health and physical problems.
Yeah, absolutely. You were getting stalked, Rachel. There was a cat coming up behind you. She was going to pounce on your head. Anybody else want to share an example?
I see it all the time, like between the 2 jobs that I worked back home in Montana. Like I worked in the pharmacy and I rode the ambulance, and I mean, the one thing my parents taught me when I was young, my mom was a nurse, my dad was a lawyer, that everybody gets sick at some point and everybody gets in trouble. So it's just, yeah, my dad was the public defender. So his clientele was, typically people that were struggling, they couldn't afford an attorney. So just always keep that in mind. But I saw that a lot at work, like, people who would pay out hundreds of dollars for medicine, and the little old lady who, I know that she's picking between heat and her meds.
Oh.
It kills me. Like, that kills me. I hate it.
Yeah.
I feel like we could do so much better, but I don't know how. So.
Well, hopefully this class will give you maybe some ideas,
Yeah.
a place to start, so that we all can go and save the world, right? Yay! So we've talked a little bit, okay, we've identified, right? Occupation is affected. with differences in wealth, social privilege, race, gender, abilities, and disabilities. And so this is all under like the social justice type of realm, right? And so there's this thing called social determinants of health, right? And so all of these are social things that are going on socially in our society, and they have direct correlations to one's one's health outcome, which could be mortality, it could be morbidity, like a disease or an illness, life expectancy, right? Limitations. It really can have a compounding effect on our health. And so the first thing we need to have, or not first thing, but the first thing on the list here, is economic stability, right? So that is a social determinant of health. What we mean by economic stability, okay, is, do you have employment? Do you have steady income? Okay, is your income able to cover your expenses? Is your debt manageable? Can you pay for your medical bills? Do you feel like you have economic supports? If you have those things in place, you will have a healthier life, right? Now think about somebody who's unemployed, somebody who's full of debt and can't pay their bills, somebody who is so in debt because of medical bills and they don't have any support. Okay, they likely aren't going to go back to the doctor. They likely may lose their housing. They may likely become homeless, or they may likely not be able to afford food, those kinds of things. So it can have this disastrous effect that affects one's overall health. Right. And they're kind of building blocks on each other. Like if you don't have one, you may lose a couple others, which then really affects your overall health. Right. So neighborhood and physical environment. Do you have safe housing? Are you able to get to and from around your neighborhood? Like, do you have adequate transportation, or can you walk places with the walkability? Do you feel safe in your community? Are there adequate parks and playgrounds, right? If you don't have those things, again, that's going to affect your health. Education. Can you read? Can you understand and speak the language with the community that you're around? Okay, do you have access to early childhood education? Vocational training, would you have access to that, or access to higher education? And I'll show you a slide a little bit later as how education is perceived to affect health. Food, okay? Hungry, are you hungry? If you're hungry, you can't learn. If you're hungry, you're going to get sick, right? You can die without sustenance, right? But further, do you have access to healthy options? And so and I'm going to get personal here for a little bit, but and maybe off and on throughout, but the mother to my children grew up on a very small town in a reservation, and they never had a grocery store. And they lived like 3 hours from Bismarck, 3 hours from somewhere in South Dakota, and they never had fresh produce, right? She was on assistance for food, but they never had access to fruits, vegetables, any of those kinds of things. And so as she grew up, as she started having children of her own, she never knew what to do with an orange. She never knew what to do with lettuce, or, and it was green, gross. And so if you don't have exposure to some of those things, she never had early childhood education. In fact, it was just a couple years ago when she finally achieved her GED. And so, and that's in her upper 20s now. So never had access to healthy options because of where she lived and because of what education she did receive. She didn't know any better, right? And so I'm trying to help her understand some of those concepts, like, hey, you can't just feed your kid Pops and Cheetos or Pop and Cheetos. They get sick, right? They get sick and they throw up, and they do, and it's neon orange on my carpet, and I had to remove all of my carpet. And that's when we had visitation with her, and it's like, hey, you know what? Have you ever thought of an orange? You know, the little tiny cuties, your kids love them and they're healthy. And I've taught them to peel them themselves. So it's good fine motor skills, right? And so trying to provide some education to her to offer access to healthy options. And she even said, like, nobody ever gave that to me. I've never tried one. I didn't know what to do with it. She goes, I got a box of cheese, and, you know, we always had like Cheetos at the gas station, and we always had Pop at the gas station. That was good. And that's all we had. So those areas are known as food deserts. So if anybody wants to look more into that, that is a problem in our society, where some places, because of where we live, don't have access even to healthy options, nor even know what they are because of their education and because of their experience. So looking at our community and social situation, okay, are people able to integrate socially, respectfully, well, right? Are they able to engage in community activities? Or do they face discrimination? Do they feel like they have supports, adequate supports and support systems that they can access, that they can trust in their community? Now, you know, I didn't follow what happened in Minneapolis this summer, that you know, expanded into our Black Lives Matter. I didn't, you know, piece all of that together. I followed it as much as I could. But what I took away from that, and what I took away from that was there are people in that community that didn't feel safe, right? Police officers are meant to be placed in our community to help people feel safe. And something happened, right? Something occurred, and there are individuals in that community then who no longer felt safe. The people who were there to protect them, they couldn't trust to feel safe. And what happened as a result? Social disintegration, right? With the rioting and all of those things that happened. So because that community and social context, people felt like there was discrimination. People didn't feel safe in their community, or they couldn't even go to the grocery store down the street because of fear. That stemmed into a disintegration, which affected and which affects your health, your mental health, your mortality. Okay, so that's what I took away from some of the things this summer. Healthcare system. Do you have health insurance? Do you have health coverage? Is your doctor available? Okay, even around here, if you want to get into a dermatologist, right, you have to make an appointment a year in advance. It's ridiculous. Okay, think about provider linguistic and cultural competence. So if you're somebody who doesn't speak English, what's the likelihood that you're even going to go to the doctor because they won't understand you, right? And I have another slide showing a really big issue with this piece, which then stems into quality of care. Okay, so all of these things are considered social determinants of health: economic stability, neighborhood, physical environment, education, food, community and social context, healthcare systems. And so when we think of social determinants of health, and we look at how our social services is set up, they do provide some economic assistance. They do have some assistance with housing. They may help with early childhood education, with our BSEPs and our Head Starts and some of those types of early childhood programs, right? They do offer EBT. They do offer certain support groups within our community to try and help, such as parenting classes and those kinds of things. They do offer Medicaid services if you're a certain lower socioeconomic status or have certain disabilities or abilities, so that they can access certain health care. But it's not enough, right? We all know instances and examples where this simply just might not be enough. And people are certainly falling through the cracks. Here's some examples of how social determinants of health, accessing healthcare, right, is different for certain races of people. Okay, and I know it's a little bit fuzzy here. I tried to blow it up, but this is non-elderly adults. Okay, this is just your typical adult who did not see a doctor because of how much it cost. Okay, and they divvied it out by race. And so this is in 2018. So this is after the Healthcare Affordability Act even, right? And so we have our highest percentage of individuals, a group of people who did not see a doctor because it cost too much, was a Hispanic population at 21%. Okay, they would not see a doctor because it costs too much, even after the Healthcare Affordability Act. Okay, AIAN is American Indian Alaskan Native, 19%. Native Hawaiian, okay, Pacific or other Pacific Islander, also 19%. They're on the far right-hand side. 17% individuals who are Black. Okay, so those four races are the highest populations of people that still would not access a doctor. What happens when we don't see our doctor regularly? What happens when we don't see our doctor even when we're sick? We become sicker or we die, right? And so here again, the importance of health disparity, health inequity, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, but we see a pretty substantial difference here. And it comes down to race for this particular thing. It comes down to race. Okay. So why aren't Native Hawaiians, why aren't American Indians, why aren't Hispanic and Black individuals going to their doctor regularly? Why is cost an issue for them and it's not necessarily an issue for Asian and white people? I don't know. Here's another example. It's an older example. It's from 2012. I couldn't find as beautiful of slide as this. I just love how it breaks it down. But this is your self-reported health by education. Okay, so how much education you receive. So the more education you receive, right? And so on the bottom, we see on the far left side, less than high school. The second to left, high school degree. Okay, the middle one is college or associate's degree. The next one on the right, bachelor's degree. And on the far right is graduate degree. Okay, so this is interviewing people, asking them to rate how well their health is. And they found that people with a graduate degree and bachelor's degree reported way higher excellent and good health. Huge, right? But people with less than a high school degree, look how high their fair and poor, their yellow and green, is related to those who have a bachelor's degree or graduate degree. There's a difference there in how they report their health. Interesting, right? So that difference in health is called health disparity. There's a health disparity. There's a difference in health that's closely linked with either some type of social or economic disadvantage. And again, this is a quote: health disparities negatively affect groups of people who've systematically experienced greater social or economic obstacles to health. Maybe access to insurance, maybe access to seeing a doctor. These obstacles stem from characteristics linked to discrimination, or exclusion, such as race or ethnicity, religion, socioeconomic status, gender, mental health, sexual orientation, or geographical isolation or location. Okay, other characteristics where some people may have health disparities, a difference in health status, is because of cognitive, sensory, or physical disabilities. So those individuals with disabilities that OTs work with on a daily basis aren't necessarily as healthy as people without a disability. Okay, and so health disparities refer to population-specific differences in disease rates, okay, health outcomes, how are they accessing healthcare services? And that's not just the doctor, you guys, that's us, that's accessing OT, right? We know we make a difference in people's quality of life, but there's some reasons why people don't access even OT or PT or speech or any other type of healthcare services. Okay, and so these are coming from, even in 2009, the US Department of Health, right? And AOTA is a strong advocate in OT, is able to promote health and well-being of individuals. Now, sometimes in the literature, we see health inequities, right? So I kind of see health inequities, health disparities is something very similar. Okay, and so health inequities, you'll see sometimes in the literature, is an unfair or avoidable difference in health between groups of people, within countries, or between countries. So when researching this, I did some slides. The Sierra Leone, the country in Africa, right? Huge health difference in life expectancy in children, right? And so those stem from those social determinants of health. So accessing education, accessing healthy foods, accessing healthcare, right? And result in stark differences in health and overall health outcomes. So health inequities is really charged with, or is really defined by the World Health Organization. The health disparities from the slide before is usually talked about under the US Department of Health. Okay, so again, they're very similar in nature. They're just from two different entities. One is World Organization, one is specifically US. So some variations in the term disparities and inequities occur between countries. And so the US, we usually use maybe disparities, and then we focus on, not focus on, but we really denote racial or ethnic disparities, perhaps because of structural racism. So what are policies in place that just occur that consciously or subconsciously leave a particular race out of the running, right? And other forms of unjust discrimination that's going to create gaps in health. Inequities, often used in the United Kingdom, used to describe differences in socioeconomic status or conditions. Okay, so again, there's some subtle differences there, but basically the same thing, right? There are differences among groups of people, whether it be race, whether it be socioeconomic status, whether it be an issue with social determinant of health. There's an issue there and it's affecting people's health. Here's another slide that I really liked the visuals on. Again, looking at health inequities, health disparities. Okay, so on the very top, well, what the slide is depicting is African Americans are more likely to die early ages from all causes. And so the bottom left picture is ages 18 to 34. The middle is 35 to 49, and the far right is age 50 to 64. Okay, and then the maroon color depicts the African American population, and the light green color represents the white population. Okay, and so the bottom slide is deaths. Okay, so you can see that the maroon color is higher with deaths in the younger 18 to 34 population, in the middle-aged 35 to 49 population. And look at how different it is with the 50 to 64 population. Why is there such an inequity there? Why are more people dying at greater rates than not? Okay, and so we have on the very top, high blood pressure. Okay, African Americans have high blood pressure more than white individuals, ages 18 to 34, 35 to 49, and 50 to 64. The middle picture on the top is related to diabetes, right? Ages 18 to 34, Black people have higher incidences of diabetes. 35 to 49 is higher. 50 to 64 is even more higher. Stroke. Okay, 18 to 34 is higher for individuals who are Black. 35 to 49, individuals who are Black have higher incidences of stroke, and same for 50 to 64. And so we see issues with high blood pressure. We see issues, or not issues, differences with high blood pressure, differences with diabetes, differences with stroke. So there is health inequity there. There is some type of health disparity that is occurring here. And this is just one example depicted from race. And this was received off the Center of Disease Control. Now, this is an example that I really wanted to share. Okay, how are you guys doing? Do you need a break? I get so carried away here. I can't see anybody's picture. Where's everybody at?
I mean, I'm super interested in what we're talking about, but also like a little break would be good.
Yeah, let's take a break here. I'm going to stop sharing so I can see everybody. Let's see here. I've got 8:59, so let's come back at 9:10. All right, I have 9:10, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. I've got quite a few slides to think I cut back on some of the info. I'm going to go through our next few slides rather quickly. I'm not sure, have you guys ever heard of the ACEs study, the Adverse Childhood Experiences study? It was a longitudinal study. I think the CDC published it. It was pretty groundbreaking because they looked at children who have experienced adverse childhood experiences such as emotional, physical abuse, sexual abuse, witnessing things that are violence, a lot of those awful things. Excuse me. And so the number of adverse childhood experiences you have as a child, right? If you have 2 instances of like maybe physical abuse and sexual abuse, or you have 3 instances of, witnessing domestic violence, physical abuse, sexual abuse, the more experiences you get, and that's what ACEs is, the adverse childhood experiences. So the higher number you get, they found a direct relationship to health issues as an older adult. Okay, and so the more ACEs you get, the higher your ACEs score, has a direct influence on obesity as an adult, diabetes as an adult, depression, suicide attempts, sexually transmitted diseases or infections, heart disease, cancer, stroke, COPD, broken bones. Okay, all of those things. So the higher number of instances you have as a child has a direct relationship to those particular things in life, in health, with health. So huge health disparity, health inequity between adults who have experienced trauma as children compared to adults who didn't experience trauma as children. Okay. Also looking at behaviors, smoking, alcoholism, drug use, also looking at graduation rates, lower graduation rates for those who have higher ACEs scores, lower academic achievement, lost time from work. And so you'll see that life potential, right? Accessing education, accessing higher education, having a job, all of those are social determinants of health. So a higher ACEs score also impacts health, but then it also impacts social determinants of health that further impact health, right? And so this learning information about this in with my role as a foster parent has just been very sad to me, and I see the issue here. I'm gonna keep moving on because I could lecture about that for ages. Julie Bass Haugen is an OT, and she identified in an unequal treatment report. So she gathered a bunch of data and basically identified from more than 100 studies that there is an enormous difference in quality of life or quality of care for different racial and ethnic groups. Okay, so she pulled data from all kinds of reports, over 100 reports, and found that because somebody had a particular race or ethnicity, they were reporting much lower quality of care when they were accessing healthcare. Okay, and when we look at some of our other slides, previous slides, we could see that, right? We see that they're not accessing healthcare, they're not going to their doctor. And so here is evidence in the field of OT, the Journal of OT, right, that there's a lot of evidence that suggests there is something going on, whether there's bias, prejudice, there's something going on here. So AOTA in 2013 came out with a statement that we have as OTs the responsibility to intervene, not just with individuals, but with communities to limit the effect of these inequities that result in these disparities. And they're saying that as OTs, we have knowledge and skills with evaluating and intervening with people and groups who face certain challenges to their participation. Right? And it's in alignment with our OT code of ethics. So it's right up OT's alley. And so again, we come back to occupational justice. It's still evolving, right? It rests on the idea that people, groups of people are different and have different needs. Those needs are addressed through occupations. And humans are social with social values, rules, constraints, cultures that live in our communities. Right. And so when we look at what are the outcomes, right? What is the change mechanism for using or viewing people through that occupational justice lens, right? What's that change mechanism? Well, it's finding occupations to be meaningful, allowing them the ability to participate, and giving them the choice in their occupations and providing balance, right? So just having that occupational right to find occupations, to participate, to have choice in what occupations they want to engage in, and to provide balance in their life. And so when you don't have occupational rights, when you can't engage in your occupations you find meaningful, that's a result of injustice, okay? It's not fair. You're not having your occupational rights. And so when you look at that from a society, a community, when you have injustices that are occurring, You may end up with civic disturbances. You may end up with ethical breakdowns and social disintegration. And we certainly saw that this summer. When you're looking at individuals just on an individual basis, right, where people can't engage in an occupation, right, they experience symptoms very much like a disease. Stomach ache, headache, being chronically stressed, difficulty with appetite, maybe difficulty with digestion. I mean, all of those things that we experience when we're under such chronic stress and anxiety, right? And so it's not disease, it's dis-ease, very similar to disease though. And so different injustices that we're going to look at next is just when we're not able to engage in meaningful occupations. And so it may result in occupational imbalance and may result in occupational deprivation, marginalization, or alienation. And so we'll talk about those. What happens when we are occupationally imbalanced? Okay, this occurs when balance between occupations is disrupted. And so you're not having a balance with rest, sleep, physical activities of daily living. You're not having a balance with all of your occupations. You have to maybe focus on one. And so an example might be when most of your time is allocated to paid work, okay, which means you're not able to focus as much on family or leisure skills, right? You're imbalanced. You're doing more time maybe at work. This occurs in societies where when people aren't utilized for their skills, and we'll talk about problem conditions with employment, overwork and underwork a little bit later. But can anybody throw out an example that is quite obvious, that is quite forefront in the center of all of your lives about occupational imbalance?
School.
Yay, thank you. How many hours a day do you guys work or study? Are you in class? Are you maybe getting a job so you can pay tuition or paying for rent or all of those things, right? I mean, you guys are severely occupational imbalanced right now. And how does that affect you, right? Well, I can just observe, that affects students' health, right? I feel like students get sick a lot more just with colds and those kinds of things because you're run down, you're chronically stressed, right? That dis-ease, right? I can tell when you guys have a lot of exams on one day because you're crabby, right? And you're irritable. And, that's part of that dis-ease because you're occupationally imbalanced, right? So I totally see that. I totally see the effects of occupational justice. So how can we get past it though, right? How do you guys cope? What's one thing that makes it meaningful for you to be in school and to put yourself through all of this imbalance? What do you think?
First generation college student.
Okay, so you're motivated, right? You're maybe having that motivation, that sense of pride because of your culture, because you want to be that example to your family, right? So there's that underlying value that's saying, I can do this, I need to do this, right? I know when I was in OT school, I felt like I was a link on a chain that was like thrown into the ocean and I was slowly being pulled up link by link every single day out of the ocean because I always felt like I was drowning, right? And the closer I got to graduation, the closer I could breathe and move on with my life. And so what inspired me was, this is temporary, right? It's one day at a time. This is temporary. When I get done with these few years, I'll be able to have more balance. And so I could see that end in sight, which then gave me the motivation to sort of punch through it. Occupational marginalization. So this occurs when people aren't given the opportunity to participate in occupations or that choice is taken away from them. So they don't have a choice, right, to engage in what they want to engage in. And so this may occur with discrimination. It may occur with, men and women, men versus women. It may be related to age, or even overall ability. Okay, and so as a result, if you're not able to engage in occupations you want to, or you're not given a choice, you may see an imbalance here that's a result also. And so in our society, occupations may be viewed poorly by some, and not even recognized as legitimate life-sustaining occupations. Okay, and so occupations may be viewed poorly by some and not even recognized as life-sustaining. Okay, so I try and think about, like, is there ever any time when you judge somebody because of the job that they do? You think, oh, how could you ever do that? Oh, that's such a nasty job. Oh, I could never do that. How awful. Those jobs tend to be considered the low of the low, right? I had a student who gave me an example of being a night janitor at some facility, right? And being that janitor was there was a lot of disrespect. There was a lot of him being made fun of, those kinds of things. And so being that janitor was viewed poorly by some, right? And perhaps not even recognized as life sustaining. And he saw it as, hey, it's just putting me through school. It's temporary. I can do it, right? So he found that motivation, again, because of that end result. An example of marginalization could be occupational apartheid, where occupations are still paid and maybe valued by some, but completely taken for granted or exploited by others. Okay, and I think of, those illegal sweatshops, right, where they're hiring young children to do their sewing and all of those things, right, where they're paid, but maybe 10 cents, 10 cents a day, and they may be valued within their own culture, within their family, because they're making some income, but they're completely being exploited, right, just for the work that they're doing. And so that can be a pretty big issue. Occupational alienation. This occurs when people experience daily life as meaningless or purposeless. Okay. Oh my gosh. So think about, and we talked a little bit about this with occupational imbalance, where you have that chronic illness, right? Like if I have to get up and go to work the next day, and I have a meaningless, purposeless job, it might be hard to get out of bed. I might have some symptoms like a stomach ache, a headache. I might feel achy. I might feel nauseous. I might just really regret getting up and going to work. And I might just want to pull the covers over my head and not go. Right. And then if I don't do that, I may chronically become depressed. Because in our jobs, sometimes our jobs, our careers are our identity. It's who we recognize ourselves with. And if what we're doing is meaningless, right, that's essentially saying that we ourselves are meaningless, and that's going to cause some chronic types of illness. And so participation, yes.
Just to add to that, so I have a sister who went through a really difficult time because of chronic illness. She's not able to work, and she was suicidal because she didn't think that she had a right to live anymore. She's married, they have a great dog, she's happy, she has lots of occupation, she's an artist, she's so many amazing things, right? However, when her ability to work was taken away from her, because she's passing out all the time, so she just couldn't do it anymore. She had the desire but couldn't do it. But the occupational alienation, that identity of not having a job that's paid, it just destroyed her. So sometimes when we view people who don't have a job as being worthless, they just sit on their butt all the time and do nothing. Is that occupational alienation also?
I feel like that's maybe lending more towards problem conditions of employment. And we'll talk about that It's a type of occupational deprivation, right? And we'll talk about that emerging lifestyle of being unemployed and the risk factors that go along with that. But I consider occupational alienation when people do have a job, right? But they're just feeling like it's meaningless or purposeless. And so I think of you know, just think about any meaningless job that you might have, right? And just for the sake of time, I'm not going to go over any major stories here, but I think we all probably can think of jobs personally to us that we would never want, right? That we would not find meaning in. And so, what is it like? Have you ever had one of those jobs? Certainly you've all engaged in some kind of meaningless task, right? And for me, when I've engaged in some of those meaningless tasks that I just have no motivation to do, I tend to procrastinate them, right? Until I absolutely have to do them. And when I'm doing them, it feels like every second is an hour that passes, right? Time moves by so slowly and it's so painful. And so, and we can reflect on ourselves, how do we find meaning in that? Right. And for me, finding meaning might be different than how you find meaning, or it might be different than how you find meaning. But, there is a reason why some people do and choose or have to do some of those meaningful jobs or meaningless jobs and meaningless occupations. Okay, maybe it's providing for their family. Maybe it's doing the meaningless job because in a couple years you'll be doing a meaningful job, right? So occupational deprivation. So where engagement of individuals, families, groups, communities, or populations in occupations of necessity are limited due to things outside of their control. Okay, so they're deprived of their occupations because of some reason outside of their control. Okay, and so an example of this, maybe children not able to play with toys that are developmentally appropriate because of a lower socioeconomic status, or because they don't have the physical ability to do so. Okay. Or maybe their social situation is they have to go into child labor to try and bring in income to their family that's also lower socioeconomic status. And so what we know about children who don't have access or can't play, right, they tend to fail to develop emotionally, physically, and cognitively. And we even see that with children who are neglected, right, who are brought into foster care. 61% of children brought into foster care have developmental delay, as opposed to 3% of the population. 61% compared to 3% of the general population, because of occupational deprivation, which was a result of neglect, right? Another example, adults isolated in prisons, refugee camps, institutions with limited range of occupations become unconnected with the real world. Okay, they develop depression, they become physically frail, they become disconnected from others because they can't engage in things that are culturally relevant to them, that binds them to their family or makes them feel like they belong. Okay, so injustice results when society tolerates certain populations become deprived while others have full reign, right? Now, a smaller sub-piece to occupational deprivation that perhaps we all can probably relate to on a close level is occupational disruption, right? Disruption of occupation, similar to occupational deprivation, but it's considered temporary, right? It may be considered having COVID, right? And being quarantined for 30 days, even, if you will, right? Or having a fracture and you can't do the occupation you want to do because you're non-weight bearing or because you have a cast. Okay, it's temporary. There could be some control by the individual, right? Where deprivation, that control is completely taken away. So if you have no access for job, employment, income, do you have some control by moving to a new town? Okay. With supportive conditions, that temporary state can be resolved. So there could be some level of choice there. And it can recur because of individual circumstances too. So, okay, I'm going to become occupationally disrupted because I'm going to pick up another work shift instead of going out with friends. Or I'm going to stay home in my apartment because I'm grieving and I don't want to be around other people right now, right? After disruption, people usually return back to regular occupational functioning, or they change their priorities, right? I remember the first time I became a parent, right? And placing greater value in leisure skills because that was something I took for granted, right? Like, I'm just going to throw what I have down here. I'm going to go, for a jog by the river, right? And I can't do that with a baby, right? That's napping. And so what did I do? Did I become depressed? No, I just changed my priority, right? Fitness became a little bit less important, where parenting became more important and more meaningful and just as meaningful. So when we focus on deprivation, we have geographical isolation, problem conditions of employment, incarceration, sex role stereotyping, refugeeism, and disability. Okay, and so again, we're focusing on deprivation, being deprived. So when we're deprived of occupation, it could be because of where we're located, being geographically isolated. Right? My children's mother growing up on a reservation in the middle of nowhere with a population of 40 people, right? That affects people socially too. They don't have access to get that feedback, right? So when you're involved socially, right, you receive some of that social feedback like, oh, you must not have showered in 2 weeks. You stink, right? That's providing somebody feedback. Where somebody maybe who lives in the middle of nowhere, what's the point of showering? I don't know. Like, it seems like a big waste of time. I don't know, right? And so if you're geographically isolated, you may not be able to get feedback about yourself or about your self-image or about your sense of self. And you may be awkward. It may seem awkward. When you're geographically isolated, you may have lack of resources or even lack of occupational opportunities, right? So living in the middle of nowhere on a reservation, right? No fresh fruits or fresh produce readily available, and only having a gas station. What do you do for work? What do you do for leisure? What do you do for fun? And so we see here that that sense of social isolation or geographical isolation tends to lead to maladaptive coping. Okay. Alcohol abuse, gas sniffing or huffing, right? Domestic violence, suicide is more prominent in more of those rural isolated settings. And we certainly see this to be true on our Native American reservations also. And so when I was preparing this, I really got the sense, and my heart stood out for those of you who have been quarantined for so long, right? And feeling isolated because you can't leave your place or your premises or whatever for so long. And so how has technology played a part? Has it been helpful? Is it the answer for geographical isolation, do you think? What are your thoughts on that?
I would say it's definitely a supplement, maybe not an answer, but it's a bridge, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's some hope. I think there's some hope there. I think it's better than nothing, right? And when we're looking even at access for healthcare, right? Like even during these times, looking at lots of therapies for my own kids, PTOT speech, right? What are we doing? We're doing telehealth. Is it perfect? No. But is it better than nothing? Absolutely. Absolutely. Problem conditions of employment. So this is when maybe somebody becomes unemployed. Our unemployment rates in our society, we tend to keep an eye on those. We tend to keep an eye on our unemployment rates getting higher or lower in our communities. And overall, unemployment tends to get worse. And unfortunately, those who are unemployed, the longer they stay unemployed, the harder it is to become employed, right? And so as a result of unemployment, we're seeing more of these emergent lifestyles of people getting welfare or economic assistance, right? And when people get some of those types of assistance, they may have to watch how much money they make, otherwise they'll lose that assistance, right? So if their income, if they're working, 2 days a week and their income is based on that and they get supplemental assistance, why would they want to work more hours for less than what they're getting for assistance, right? And so it makes sense. Like, I don't know if I would want to either, right? Like, I'm not being lazy. I don't know. And so you see people who are on government assistance a lot longer because our minimum wage is still low, and they get more assistance. They get more income by not working as much than if they were to have to work a lower minimum wage job, which may be what they're qualified for. In the literature, they said people are becoming extended full-time students. I don't know about that. I don't know. It was, an emergent lifestyle where people just continue taking out student loan, and they just kind of stay in school and those kinds of things. And I think we're seeing some government tapping out on some of that lately. But single parenthood also certainly is a lifestyle, if you will, and how do you balance parenting and trying to work, and how much do you work, and daycare is so expensive. Oh my gosh. It's crazy. And so when you're unemployed, though, there's a much higher link to that lower self-esteem, having a lower self-confidence, lower self-worth, in which case then you have higher suicidal ideation or suicide attempts, and even issues with self-harm. Again, what we do is sometimes tied to our identity, right? I introduce myself to somebody. The first question they ask, what do you do? Oh, okay, well, I teach at UMary. What do you teach? It's like, you want to know anything else? Okay, bye. Right. And so it's kind of how we identify ourselves. So unemployment's a problem condition of employment. Underemployment and overemployment are also problem conditions. Underemployment might be that we're overqualified for a job. Okay, but we can't maybe get another job. We have to maybe satisfy for something that's lower in pay. We're not fully doing what we're capable of or what we're trained of. And so we're going to be chronically stressed because we're having to work a much lower income job. And so, or maybe not work as many hours. And so since we can't afford a lot of things, we may have less materials, but we may have more time on our hands. Okay. Overemployment is when we're forced to work more hours for less. Okay. So really focusing on your productivity, and you're chronically stressed because if you're overemployed, you're always working, right? Having 2, 3, 4 jobs. So you don't have any time, but you are bringing in a little bit more income because of that. I brought up earlier incarceration. So the deprivation of liberty, we use this as a punishment, right? In our society, we tolerate this because it's a punishment, where we remove people from society because they committed a crime. Now, I think of prisons. Prisons are considered institutions. Okay, I also think there are other institutions that we're aware of. Institutions like skilled nursing facilities, that's an institution. A university is an institution, right? A school is an institution, right? How many, when you guys were going to high school thought, what is this, a prison? Right? I certainly remember saying that. And so it causes deprivation because you're sometimes taking away occupational choice. Okay, in high school, you can't leave the grounds at lunchtime, right? So, oh my gosh, I don't have that choice to leave the grounds at lunch, to go grab, lunch at the gas station, whatever. And so certainly prisons are a little bit extreme to that, right? They're really in regards to safety, so they're restricting tool use, right? Prisons are often geographically isolated as well. And so you see people who are incarcerated, who are in tiny little cells, they tend to go stir crazy because of occupational deprivation. And what I mean by that is they become disoriented. They become disoriented to time. They become disoriented to their inactivity. And you see people even starting to go psychotic and have issues of psychoses when they're incarcerated for so long. As a result, they have increase in boredom. And then we have rising rioting and suicide in prisons. So with growing incarceration rates, we see many prisons are full. They're subject to federal funding and cuts and losses of programs, but something's not working here. There's a huge inequity here. And is that fair? Is that doing something better for our society by not giving them programs to prepare them to live out in the world, versus just shoving them away, taking away all occupational rights? I don't know. That's usually a discussion that gets quite heated that we have, but it's an area. Sex role stereotyping, where you may have social judgments, what men or women typically should or should not do based on their gender. And so when I think of examples in history, right? In history, what was the job of the woman? To have children, to keep a house, to cook food, to do all of those things, right? What was the job of a man? To be the provider, to hunt and fish, and the women be the gatherers, right? So we have specific examples in our history. Hopefully things have evolved today, but what are the roles of a man today? What are the roles of a female today? Are there certain looks or clothes that are more appropriate for a man to wear compared to a woman, or vice versa? What do you guys think? What are some of the roles today?
I think all those boundaries are being pushed right now. You look at Harry Styles, right? Are you familiar with him at all? He's a singer.
Mhm.
Okay, so what he wears, he crosses into what a female would generally wear, like a pearl kind of necklace. That's not very masculine. Men are wearing necklaces, but not pearl kinds, So I think a lot of boundaries are being, I shouldn't, maybe not crossed, but just removed and changed and blurred a little bit in stereotyping.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I would agree with that. But I do think, and I have a 13-year-old foster son right now, and he asked me if he could paint his fingernails the other day. And I was like, oh my gosh, sure. But I felt, I felt weird about it, because growing up, that was, I don't know. And so I asked him, like, is that something that other young men are doing? Because, I'm thinking, God, I don't want you to get I don't want you to get beat up at school or anything, right? And he's like, no, there's a few boys who are painting their fingernails, but we usually do it just, like we paint them black. And I'm like, okay, well, moving on. Well, let's see about that, I guess. But yeah, I mean, I think there are some things. And was I judgy about it? Kinda. Yeah, I didn't mean to be. I let him do it because it's an occupation he found meaningful, and I knew I was coming up with this lecture, right? So, but here's some fingernail polish remover in case you ever want to take it off whenever you're ready. I don't know. You just think I'm a horrible person now. Anyways, I think some of these things are embedded in us though. And it's, like, we don't even realize what it is. Refugeeism. Okay, when refugees come here to the United States, they're usually the victims of violence, persecution. They're escaping trauma they may never recover from. Think about it. They're coming to an unfamiliar place. They're isolated because they may not speak the same language. They may be placed into a refugee camp with thousands of other refugees that speak different languages and do different cultures or are familiar with different cultures. They may be ripped from their families, from their friends, right? They're not able to engage in normal familiar occupations. Use of tools, objects, places, similar foods, being involved in their family, all of those things that we take for granted and have meaning to our lives, right? They may not be able to practice their culture or their religious beliefs. And they obviously, if they can't get a job and they're stuck in a refugee camp, they're going to be socially and economically isolated as well. And when they're placed in when they're placed in refugee camps, that can extend into years because of all of the policy issues and political issues that we have going on in our society because of immigrants, right? And immigration laws and all of those things. And so as a result, and I've this was fairly recent in our community here was, will we allow refugees into our community? And people had to vote on it. I was so disappointed that we would even have to vote on something like that. Like, why wouldn't we want refugees in our community? And so there was some awful, embarrassing news campaigns that were going on. It was just appalling. And certainly, though, it was demonstrating that there is prejudice. There's prejudice right here in our community. And I think of now more relatable examples. When I lived in Dickinson, we had an F3 tornado go through and it removed like the south side of our town. And there were clients I had that lived on the south side and they had to move into a camper. Right? They had to move into a little FEMA trailer for a while until they could buy a camper. And then they lived in their driveway with their house that was completely, the roof was ripped off and those kinds of things. And so they were displaced, right? Their occupations changed. They had to cook on a little stove top. They had to wait and live in really tight, crammed corners. Luckily, they had each other. Right? Luckily, they had each other and they had family support and those kinds of things. But I can tell you, their occupations were quite disrupted and changed because of that. Disability. We have known this as OTs from the beginning of time, right? Individuals who have disabilities, whether they're physical, psychological, emotional, or cognitive, maybe congenital or acquired, have limitations performing occupations, right? They may be occupationally deprived because they don't have the ability to do it. There are certain aspects of our profession where we're like, and I can't remember which theorist said this, but there's no such thing as disability. It's just changing and altering the environment to match the patient, to match the person, right? You can always find somebody capable of something and try and match the environment to that. But we also have to look at whatever community we're in, what are the social values or attitudes regarding individuals with disabilities? Do they have the ability to go to the supermarket? Do they have access to transportation? Do they have access to meaningful jobs and contributing to the economy? Okay, and as OTs, I think what can we do to help? I think, and I'm a little going over here on time, but what can we do to help? This is the whole premise of why you guys are in OT, right? What we can do to help. Adaptive equipment, assistive technology, restoring function, altering the environment, all of those things we're used to. Okay, and so the point I want to get to, implications, potential for OT practice. What can we do with all of this social justice? What can we do with occupational justice, with these geographical, employment, incarceration, sexual stereotyping, refugee, disability? Do we have in our profession an acceptable framework that connects us to the values and theoretical foundations of OT? Do we have frameworks in our profession? What are they? Do we have evidence that guide our interventions for certain populations of people? Do we have any of that we could apply to these populations that are experiencing this? Where would you get guidance from?
Are you talking about the AOTA framework?
I'm talking about a model of practice. A model of practice guides our practice. It's broad enough to span everything. It's broad enough to span across discipline, or not across disciplines, across OT settings. They're meant to be broad, right? They're meant to increase occupational participation. They're meant to have you look at and evaluate where people are at risk for. This brings us to our final assignment, right? And here's just some ideas that I have where some of my students have gone in and are focusing their deck on. I've gone to many AOTA conferences, and these are specific examples that you can find in the literature of OTs making a difference. But for our assignment here, okay, this is part B, model analysis and application. I want you, and you do this individually, this is your final cumulative paper, you choose an at-risk population that is at risk for experiencing occupational injustice and some type of disparity, health inequity. You find that population, you outline what are the social determinants of health. Are they not accessing education? Do they not have access to food, healthy food? Do they not have safe environments? How is that impacting their occupational participation? Okay. Explain and justify how and in what ways each of the main components of your model, and you can use your model from part A, apply to your population. So if your model defined the person as sensory motor, cognitive, psychological, how are those components related to your population? How do children in foster care, if we're looking at them as a population, how is their psychological self affected? How is their sensory motor self affected? Okay, you're going to have to find literature to back that up and make sure that you're addressing each of those components of the environment, the occupations, and the person. Okay, so now with your model as a guide, what is that change mechanism, or what is that intervention? Okay, how are you going to increase or change this population? What can you offer them to increase occupational participation or performance? And I want you to identify evidence supporting the use of occupation in the promotion of health and prevention of disease. Okay, so essentially you're going to come up with some strategies, some intervention strategies, some ideas, some recommendations to this population of people guided by your model of practice, right? And you're going to identify some kind of evidence that suggests, hey, if we do this, if we promote occupation, it's going to, what is the effect going to be? Now, some of your populations that you find, there's not a lot of research out there, right? And so don't freak out. I don't want 50 emails saying, I can't find any evidence supporting, the use of shoulder pulleys on the Native American population, right? Well, you're not going to, but you might find evidence suggesting that, increasing activity decreases the likelihood of diabetes, right? And so you can tie that in, you can get creative there. And then I want you to provide a reflection on any new insights, right? So here you are using theory. You've identified a problem. You're using theory to guide how you would solve this worldly problem. You're finding evidence to support that. So now what do you think about the use of theory in OT? What's the value of using theory in our profession? And what implications does that have to your future practice? Okay, so be looking at the rubric. I know I'm going over on time, you guys, please don't crucify me. Go through the rubric, okay? And I think, do we have time? If you have questions, you can email me, but I really want you to spend time going through the rubric, going through the assignment. I have some very specific samples of populations that I know you will very easily find disparities, social determinants of health issues on those populations, right? Children in foster care, the Native American population, individuals living with HIV/AIDS, individuals who are transgender. You'll find issues very easily in those health disparities. Okay, I'm sorry I kept you so long. I hope you could feel my passion. This all accumulates to this moment right here, and I'm so looking forward to how you guys are going to save the world.
And Fargo students, just direct your questions directly to me. I'm also open to meeting with you to explore, thoughts or questions or whatever. And the best way to do that is to have your class representatives send me some possible times for meeting. And that way we can get something on the calendar. Okay?
Yes, and Faustina just says, remember to reach out to welder librarians if you need help finding research.
They're available over the phone too, if anyone, any of the Fargo students want it. And there's also research guides on the welder library page that will help you navigate like resources and do APA citations and find good articles and limit your search and things like that.
Thank you guys.
Thanks,
Have a good week.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, thank you.
Have a good weekend.